Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to the 2021 Nelson W. Trout Lectures in Preaching. And welcome virtually to Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University in Columbus, Ohio. My name is Kit Kleinhans, and I am the Dean of Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University. The Nelson W. Trout Lectures in Preaching honor the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Nelson Wesley Trout, a Capital University alumnus, a Trinity alumnus, a member of the Trinity Lutheran Seminary faculty, and the first African American to be elected a bishop in U.S. Lutheranism. This year's event is the 29th Nelson W. Trout Lectures, and the first time we are holding the event virtually. I will be your host and moderator for much of today and tomorrow. We know that many of you are regulars at the Trout Lectures. We hope that this year's virtual platform is also an opportunity for us to welcome newcomers to this event. Let me provide a brief overview of the schedule. This afternoon's session will feature a keynote presentation by the Reverend Dr. Beverly R. Wallace, Associate Professor of Congregational and Community Care at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dr. Wallace's theme is, "Do you want to be well? 'Cause wholeness ain't no trifling thing. The necessity of healing work in theological education for authentic diversity." Following Dr. Wallace's presentation, there will be an opportunity for live question and answer with the speaker. Please post your questions in the chat box or the Q&A section of this Zoom webinar. Following a break, we will reconvene at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Our evening session will feature brief presentations by and a conversation with several Black doctoral students. These rising scholars, like their mentor, Dr. Wallace, are deeply committed to theological education for authentic diversity. We hope you will return tomorrow. The schedule is full, with a worship service at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, discernment conversations for persons of African descent at 1 o'clock and at 8 p.m., a conversation about womanist theology at 2:30, and a Bible study about discernment and vocation at 3:30, led by students from 2 of our partner ELCA seminaries. Please note that while most of these events will take place via this Zoom webinar link, the discernment conversations and the Bible study require separate registrations so that participants can enter Zoom rooms in which they have the ability to interact with other participants. We gratefully acknowledge that the discernment conversations and the Bible study are co-sponsored by the seminaries of the ELCA, with financial support from the Richard Hay Barkelow Charitable Fund at the In Faith Community Foundation. Throughout this event, please feel free to post questions or challenges you may be having with technology, either in the chat function or by sending an email to trinitydean@capital.edu. We ask you to be patient with us. This is our first major virtual event, and we are grateful that you are here to join us.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing presence has brought us, facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on to victory is won. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light. Keep us forever in our path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. The Reverend Dr. Beverly R. Wallace is Associate Professor of Congregational and Community Care at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dr. Wallace earned her bachelor's degree in social welfare, cum laude, at Adelphi University in New York. Her Master of Education in Human Development and Family Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. A Master of Divinity degree at Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary in Columbia, South Carolina, and a PhD in Family Social Science with an emphasis on marriage and family therapy from the University of Minnesota at St. Paul. Prior to joining the faculty at Luther Seminary in 2019, Dr. Wallace had served as Associate Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling at Shaw University Divinity School in Raleigh, North Carolina. Before that, she had served as Assistant Professor and Director of Ministry and Context at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And prior to that, she had served as Assistant to the Bishop of the Southeastern Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, with responsibilities for candidacy and leadership, and also for pastoral care for the Mississippi Gulf Coast recovery following Hurricane Katrina. Among her many, many academic interests and specialties, she lists pastoral care and counseling, womanist theology and ethics, grief and trauma, sociology of religion, social justice, mass incorporation, and more. The first time I remember meeting Beverly was in 2009 at a conference on transformative Lutheran theologies, feminist, womanist, and mujerista perspectives, sponsored by the Justice for Women Office of the ELCA. True to her womanist commitments and to her academic training as a social scientist, Dr. Wallace did not present a paper she had crafted as a solitary academic in an ebony tower. Rather, she presented a paper drawing on the voices and insights of other Black women, incorporating their voices along with her own. Another powerful personal memory for me is the time that Beverly and I were invited to be participants in an ELCA consultation about issues pertaining to women and justice. The consultation planners had invited what they considered to be a representative group of women with diverse perspectives. Beverly, ever working from a commitment to community, asked how she had been chosen to be a participant in this consultation. Shouldn't the Black women in the church have been consulted and allowed to choose their own representative, she asked. You will hear these deep commitments to community loud and clear in this afternoon's keynote presentation. Do you want to be well? 'Cause wholeness ain't no trifling thing. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Beverly R. Wallace.
Good morning, and thank you for this invitation to present at this conference here today. I'm humbled and honored to be the presenter for this Nelson Trout Lecture series. My understanding is that it's originally supposed to be a preaching series, but as many of you know, I'm not that much of a preacher. I am a professor, I'm Dr. Beverly Wallace, professor of Congregation and Community Care at Luther Seminary. And so thank you for the invitation, for allowing me to speak at this presentation. I'm getting ready to share my screen so that you can follow along with me in this presentation that's entitled, Do You Want to Be Well? 'Cause wholeness ain't no trifling thing. And I've subtitled this, The Necessity for Healing Work and Theological Education for Authentic Diversity. So give me a moment as I prepare my screen. Yeah. So my premise is that there's some healing work that we have to do, healing work within ourselves as African ascended folks, healing that needs to occur within theological education, healing that needs to occur with European American folk, all for the purpose of authentic diversity. The Reverend Dr. Ruby Sales, former member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Council, originally founded by and directed by Ella Baker, who was a student at Shaw University, where I used to teach. Dr. Sales, at a conference at Shaw, noted, as we talked about spirituality as strongholds of Black resistance, said that as African-American folk, we have everything within us that we need. She said this at a theological institution, one of the first to educate African-American leaders to survive in a country that did not like us. Shaw was not only a place of education for young leaders in theology for the purposes of preaching and teaching, but they were the first four-year medical school in the country and the birthplace of many of the historically Black colleges and universities in the South. Dr. Sales told the audience of seminarians and other religious leaders that we are to continue to survive today because we have masterfully protected our inner lives with rituals that enable us to be soulful people whose folk theology and spirituality were strongholds of Black resistance and healing. As this is recorded, I've not seen the opening of this conference, and so I am hoping that we began this time together by pouring libations. We are to remember an important part of our healing work, remember those who came before us, such as Dr. Nelson Trout, remembering the struggles of our ancestors and remembering how they got over, remembering and engaging in rituals, as our rituals and our theology and our spirituality have always enabled us to resist, to build up, to heal, and I would say to live, to continue for another day. So I want to suggest that what Dr. Ruby Sales says is obviously true. It is our spirituality, and I would dare say our African spirituality that has enabled us to survive the onslaught of those daggers that want to take us out. Those daggers that have caused hurt and trauma to our communities and to our being. But our theology, our understanding of who God is, even as it is couched in Lutheran terms, let us not forget that Luther learned from our African father, Augustine. It is our spirituality that has protected our souls and have enabled us to be uplifted during troubling times. Are these not troubling times? In this presentation, I'm going to suggest that indeed we can continue to use our theology and our spirituality to find a way to make it through. I'm also going to suggest that we engage in what Black psychologists are asking Black people around the globe to engage in, that of emotional emancipation as a means of our own communal healing. The question is, do we want to be well? Toni Cade Bambara, in her work, The Salt Eaters, raised this question, do you want to be well? She wrote that it takes a lot of work if you want to be well because wholeness ain't no trifling thing. Like Maxine Waters did in reclaiming her time, I'm going to suggest that it is time that we, those who believe in freedom and want to be whole, African-American Lutherans and others, it's time to reclaim our African souls and engage in our own healing, a reframing of anti-Black theological education. That's a mouthful, I know. If we want to begin to address and engage in what the church is saying that we're to engage in, authentic diversity. So in this presentation, I will focus on healing work and theological education, and we'll look at authentic diversity, the authentic diversity document, as the document talks about theological education, and indeed, that is my work. I was glad to see that in the executive summary of the document on authentic diversity, that it called for healing. healing action to address the personal woundedness perpetuated by racism and racial prejudice. The document calls for a deeper diagnosis of the collective, structural, and systemic nature of these sins, and suggests that we engage in and have an opportunity for deepening our perspectives and actions toward healing. So the topic of healing, the deeper dive which I suggest is necessary for the work of authentic diversity, I want to suggest that we can do what I call a Sankofa move to do so. This Sankofa move will assist with a more robust move in theological education and leadership development. As it is said in the document, calls for a metanoia movement, a change of heart movement that is indeed needed, especially in such a time as this. The topic of this presentation was chosen a year ago, and I don't know why I chose this title, but it is still relevant today, and especially this day, as it was a year ago. A part of this work was presented at the Lutheran Women in Religion and Theological Studies American Academy of Religion pre-conference, with parts of this work also presented in my classroom, in my lectures, and in my teachings. This continued conversation was also sparked by a presentation by faculty of Macalester University in St. Paul, Minnesota. 4 African-American professors, 3 on the faculty of Macalester and 1 from the University in California, were speaking on the idea of anti-Blackness in higher education. The 4 scholars began to engage in discourse and understanding about another pandemic, the pandemic of anti-Blackness in the discipline of education. Soon after, a webinar by the Association of Theological Schools was held that engaged in a dialogue on Black Lives Matter. What was to be a follow-up conversation with the presidents and deans of the ATS institutions, of which our Lutheran seminaries are involved. The follow-up conversation was to be about Black Lives Matter and the question of where do we go from here? But this conversation melded into a conversation about diversity and their engagement in diversity projects at the various schools. Dr. Yolanda Pierce, however, the Dean of Howard University Divinity School, noted the shift and shared her observation of how the discussion moved from Black Lives Matters to that of diversity and projects of diversity, and how they in fact avoided what was the subject of the original stated topic, that of Black Lives Matter. Dr. Pierce stated that this appeared to be an avoidance of the topic of anti-Black racism and theological education. The fact is, oftentimes with the onset of the movement toward addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, we in fact do avoid anti-Black racism. Today, as I did at the Conference of Lutheran Women in Religion and Theological Studies, I want to be so bold as to name this too again and encourage us to look at and have a conversation about anti-Black racism and theological education, and specifically our Lutheran theological institutions, as we also talk about discernment, and especially as we embrace the concept of authentic diversity. I want to suggest that embracing African spirituality will help with the healing work and even the work of healing go back to my slide, sorry. Gave you a foretaste of what is to come. Still on anti-Black theological education. So I want to suggest that embracing African spirituality will help with the healing work and even the work of healing, or rather engaging with anti-Black theological education, maneuvering within it as it relates to future leaders for the church and even current leaders. To be clear, my thesis for this presentation is that in order for us as African ascended people to engage in authentic diversity, we must go back and reclaim our African spirituality, our African soul, for the purpose of our own healing, in order to fully engage in authentic diversity, and then the reframing of theological education that could be life-giving. I want to say we need theological education, but we need one that affirms our freedom, a theological education that is life-giving, transformative, and transcending, one that embraces us being reconciled in Christ, one that is of cultural humility, and at the same time engages the power of the gospel. You need to know that this work is also going on in historically Black theological institutions, where HBTIs are talking about, meeting about, engaging in the work of the collaboration of the Black church. Yes, we are a Black church within the Lutheran communion. This collaboration of Black churches with Black seminaries. This is an important topic, and I believe that Dr. Trout would want us to engage in this conversation as well. Here we go. Dr. John Kinney, one of the distinguished professors at Proctor School of Theology in Virginia, says that theology has been polluted by a disease. The disease of focusing in on the fall. He says theology that have been taught have been fall-centered. That kind of theology has been complicit and responsible for white supremacy and is interested only in protecting itself. And so Dr. Kinney raises the question similar to what I'm asking here. Do we want to participate in this disease, or do we want to be well? Are we willing, are we giving psychological assent to our chains? Or do we want to engage in our healing by engaging in subversive scholarship and counter-world construction? Again, the reason why this is the focus I'm having here on theological education. I want to begin by playing a piece from the soundtrack of the television series Queen Sugar. I'm hoping I can get this so that you can hear it. I'm sure you're going to have the ad first, so you're going to have to excuse me. We should be done, and here we go.
Keep the flight.
I'm gonna stop it here and start my PowerPoint as a way of making certain that I don't mix things up. So here we go. I'm gonna share my screen again. There we go, and get back to the right page of there. Here we are. The colors in the line. We've always been told to color in the line. You remember how when you were young, perhaps 4 or 5, our teachers told us to make certain that we color inside the lines and don't color out beyond the edge. We were told to stay within the confines of the picture someone else had constructed for us. Keep the color in the line. For most of our lives, as the world turns, we have continued to do so. Keep the color in the lines, and the world continues to turn. Keep the color in the lines. But there is more to those lyrics. The lyrics continues with the words, dreams never die. We know what happens when a dream is deferred, but here the encouraging word is that dreams never die. There are dreams we have for ourselves and dreams we have that our foreparents had for us. Yes, some of our parents told us, as the Reverend Angela Kabeb stated the other night, as we were having a sister circle conversation after the womanist conference that she didn't attend, but hung out with us anyway. She said her parents told her to play nice, be nice. Her mother and father wanted the best for her and had dreams for her, and Reverend Angela was told to be nice. The cost to conform, to stay within the lines. But dreams never die. In an article published in the journal Black Women in Religious Culture, using this idea of ambiguous loss theory within the African American context, I again employ the opening song of Queen Sugar in the writing of that article and suggest that we do what was suggested in this folklore, The People Could Fly, knowing that we have always lived with ambiguity. I suggested that we take flight. One of the other lyrics in the song. Because as Dr. Ruby Sales said, we have everything we need. The question is, do we want to be well? I want to suggest that we take flight by engaging in healing work, both for ourselves and for and within our community. Appropriate contextual theological education will in fact enable us to do so. Remember, we have everything within us that we need. We can continue to survive and even thrive using our creativity. We can take flight because we have masterfully protected our inner lives with rituals that enable us to be soulful, to remember, and to be soulful people whose theology and spirituality continues to be strongholds of Black resistance and upbuilding. Because you see, Black folks will be in the future. Part of the reason for this discernment conference, or this discernment part of this conference, there will be Black folks in the future. And in order to develop this future and engage in what is meant by authentic diversity, as suggested by the church and some of the writers of this document who are part of our community, our upbuilding can be found in our theological education, created and thought anew. Addressing anti-Black racism and theological education, I'm going to say it's a process of reparation as defined by the National Coalition of Reparation. Reparation is a process to remember, repair, restore, and to replenish. So imagine if we use this term reparation for ourselves, for our own emancipation, where we remember, repair, restore, and replenish. Before we go any further, I want to briefly define anti-Black racism. It should make sense that it means against Blackness. We know that racism exists, and we also know that race is socially constructed, but the category of race is still being used by most folk. Blackness is constructed outside, oftentimes outside the bounds of humanity, because Blacks historically could not be human. You know the history. And so Blackness or anti-Blackness supports a hierarchy that exists. You know, being against Blackness supports a particular way of being in the world. And anti-Blackness or avoidance of talking about Blackness is a way to make Blackness disappear, our humanity disappear. Similarly, when we hear the terms Black Lives Matter, there's often the counter of all lives matter. This racial neutrality on diversity attempts to make, again, Blackness disappear. It is a way of avoiding the hard and deep question and ones of the original sins of this country. And even when we say people of color, what it does is it flattens the differences and unique experiences of each of us. For example, the slave experience is quite different from the immigrant experience. Anti-Blackness steps away from and avoids the challenge of Blackness and the everyday mundane experiences of terror, torture, and disasters in the experiences of Black bodies. Dr. Linda Thomas, professor at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, during our Lutheran Women in Religious Study Conference, suggested that Blackness has been demonized, so we don't want to talk about it. But for our healing, we must. Institutions, including some theological or educational institutions, also subjugate Black bodies. As Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, a womanist theologian now deceased, and you'll hear more about womanist theology later on in this conference, says, or she asked a question in an article entitled Structuring Academic Amnesia. She asked the question, what does it mean that academic is so structured? Let me start over with that. What does it mean that academic is so structured that Black women are severely ostracized when we remember and represent in in our authentic interest. How do you think I know a little bit about that? Institutions, you see, regulate, and I'm suggesting institutions reinforce anti-Blackness. So if we are to educate leaders and to support leaders, we have to engage in some healing, perhaps also in our institutions, but more importantly, for ourselves. And as we think about theological institutions, the question is, are we schooling or are we educating? And in our theological institutions, does theology legitimize and excuse the violence against Black bodies? In that presentation at Macalester that I mentioned, one of the members of the faculty made a distinction between schooling and education. And he said the original intent of schools was to socialize people, and more specifically white men, in how to be white men. School structures society, it mirrors society. Schooling is given. Education, however, is something that one gives oneself. Schools are the tools of the state. Schools support the social contract for upper mobility. Schools normalize practices, echoes, and reinforce the nature of anti-Black racism. Education, on the other hand, liberates. Education can also heal. So there is a need for healing work even within theological education. A theological tradition, you know this, it shapes politics. You can see it all around us. Theologies that are taught are typically white theologies, and our Lutheran theological institutions are have only a few teaching theologians of color, and very few are Black. As one of, even as one of my feminist theologian friends, Merritt of PLU says, womanist theology, mujerista theologies are seen as suspect. Black theology, womanist theology, mujerista theology, liberation theology. You may get some of that in some of our seminaries, but we don't have enough teaching theologians in our church. And so I'm grateful for the panel that's going to occur later on, where our rising PhD students are going to talk about what they are going to offer for the healing work that's necessary, even in theological education, for the sake of the community. That's why we do what we do. There's a question about whether or not there's a crisis, and I'm going to get to that. But before we go that, I want to say a little bit of what Dr. Emily Towns in that conference with the Association of Theological Schools says. And I think it's the question that I raised earlier. Is the theology that we have inherited capable of responding to the killing of Black people? Is the theology that we have inherited capable of responding to the killing of Black people? I would also want to add another question. What sort of theology would be helpful in the healing work of and for our communities? And what kind of theological education is necessary and for whom? Dr. Willie Jennings, former dean of Duke Divinity School, now I believe he's at Yale, is the author of a book called Beyond Whiteness and raises additional questions, or an additional question, no additional questions. But one of them is, does theology legitimizes and excuses the violence? And that's what I raised before, the question, the violence against Black bodies. And so when we talk about authentic diversity, do we take into consideration, and I think we do, and I think that's the reason why the healing part was in that document. Do we take into consideration how to address the theology that legitimizes and often excuses the violence against Black bodies? And going back to the question of schooling versus educating, are our institutions schooling or educating? Because education offers possibilities, so healing, the idea of healing, and that's the reason why I'm so, moving toward it is emotional emancipation, this healing work, because it offers possibility. But I also know, because of how institutions are, and when I teach about systems theory, systems protect themselves. Promoting our own emancipation, our own healing comes with risk. There's the risk of being ostracized, the risk of punishment, the risk of harm and death. And so the question is, are we willing to take the risk? Do we want to be healed? Or do we want to continue to color in the lines? Or do we take flight? And as one of the professors of Macalester said, do we see this moment as a crisis or conflict? If it is a conflict, perhaps something new can come out of this if we explore it. And what I tell my students to do, the Marvin Gaye question, what's going on? Is it a crisis or a conflict? My response is that it's both. Because I do think that we have all that we need to do something different for our own healing. So imagine theological education as healing work. Imagine that it could promote justice. Imagine the possibility of a theological education that does not support anti-Blackness in its theology. Imagine. How creative can we be? In the webinar held by Macalester, I just love that webinar. The brother from California talked about the harm of anti-Black education. And I just want to touch on that a little bit as to why it's necessary. Okay. And the brother talked, interestingly enough, about telomeres. I had never heard about telomeres until I heard this lecture. And so what this brother talked about was how on our chromosomes we have telomeres. They're the protective caps of our chromosomes. And so how long or short the telomeres are signal the age of the body, the life age. And so he was talking about this in terms of education. And what he noticed was that some children who were in stressful educational systems, and that's what we're talking about, educational systems, had shorter telomeres. Again, the shorter the telomeres, the shorter the life. It's about stress. Persons experiencing stress has shorter telomeres. But what he also noted was that in his research, that when people who are experiencing racism, as we, those who are of African ascent, experience it on a daily basis, the mundane, meaning that every single ongoing small things such as, will my 20-year-old grandson be okay? When we recognize and talk about the experiences and address racism, what this researcher found was that the telomeres became elongated. One can heal when we start addressing the stressors. And later I'm going to talk about the Mies model of stress, the mundane, extreme environmental stress. When we start talking about that, our lives can be prolonged. In speaking our truths, we can extend our lives. Therefore, how we engage in theological education, because again, he was talking about the educational system, not necessarily theological education, when he was talking about the educational system of our children, but how we engage in theological education and how we might want to address anti-Black racism and theological education may save the lives of Black bodies. I know it's a stretch for some. It's like, where is she going with this? But for me, it's about healing and saving our lives. And so what I'm suggesting is that might we look again at our African spirituality as a way of engaging in the healing work that we're called to. Some of you may say, I've heard this. I doubt if you're going to hear it from people here in this conference or who are watching this virtual conference. But often some people want to dismiss African spirituality. I'm going to suggest that we look at it again. And I'm going to suggest that we're already doing that. We're engaged in African spirituality. We probably didn't really know that. This African spirituality, mental spiritual rejuvenation, the fasting that we often engage in, the remembering, the communion, remember, retelling the story. That's the reason why we're here for the Trout Lecture, telling the story of Dr. Trout and engaging in the rituals. Remember at the beginning, I talked a little bit about rituals and how Dr. Ruby Sales talked about rituals, saying that the rituals enable us to be soulful people whose folk theologies and spirituality are what's holding us and enabling us to resist. Rituals are spirit-based activities. Prayer is a request of the Spirit to be present in our affairs. And it's about a way of knowing. We have our spirituality, the life-enhancing forces, the death-diminishing forces. And we structure it around culture. I'll give you an example. I do a lot of reading about African spirituality and African psychology as well. And so in one of the books, the text that I've been using for a couple of years now, talk about the Jewish community and how Jewish families and cultures, for example, valued and honored a learned person. And historically, how they believed that the world processed things and approached things by thought alone. And what the author of this text that I'm reading said that thought is only one way of manifesting reality. And what he suggested was that KEMETIC and Hebrew mysticism embrace is another way. And that embraces the unconscious, another way of knowing. Revelation as another way of knowing, but we know that. It's another epistemological way of knowing and gaining knowledge. So I'm suggesting that perhaps we can embrace an African KEMETIC spirituality and begin to pay attention to what has historically been our way of knowing. Knowledge, knowing, education. And I'm suggesting that we again pay attention to the spirit, the unconscious, the collective unconscious that is part of and have been part of our spirituality. Spirituality is indeed an unconscious energy, it's an activity and maintenance of a life, or stirring within the soul in response to the inner calling of God. Being spiritual should not mean we are disconnected from the world. It should lead us to have a vital personal relationship with the divine. African spirituality stressed a connection of all things without a distinct separation between the sacred and the secular. And an African spirituality embraces the idea of living the paradox. In our world where we don't see things as all good, especially for us as Black folks, embracing an African spirituality, we can live in this paradox. One, we already do. Understanding this, and this is what I write in my article that was published, understanding this, that we do so, that this can save us a lot of anxiety and a lot of angst, that we live in the paradox. And recognizing that, and recognizing the tenuousness of life, we can then be creative. We can then become creative in helping to reshape some of the systems within which we're living and operating in, including our educational system, including our churches, and reshape them into liberating religious systems for African ascended people. According to Dr. Lee Butler, separating spirituality from the daily messiness of lives places us in positions of being regarded as the source of the mess. Look, for example, at the trial in Minnesota, where people want to make George Floyd the cause and the creation of his own murder. So as part of our theological education, part of our healing work, it would be to embrace our African spirituality that will promote healing. This is the book by Dr. Lee Butler, who used to be in Chicago. I'm trying to remember where he is now. And I'm so sad that we lost him as the possible dean at Luther Seminary. But his book, Liberating Our Dignity, Saving Our Souls, is one that I've used with some of my students, especially when I was working with my students at Shaw University Divinity School. What Dr. Butler has done in this book was to develop a schema for our liberating of our souls. Imagine that if we were freely, really free and liberated. And in the schema, he describes the development from an historical African-American spirituality based on our experiences here after the Ma'afa, moving us to an embracing of an African spirituality. This move is from emotional development to relational development. That's some of the work we have to do. So yes, emotional emancipation is important, but we also have to engage in relationship development. Moving from existential longing, we want things to be the way we want them to be, to this existential search for how we're going to make it happen. From learning the rules, coloring inside the lines, to an African spirituality where you live with the paradox. From identity and play, even though play I believe is important, to identity and work. And I want to stop here for a moment and look at the last part, identity and work. And what he's saying is we are not talking about employment when we're talking about work. The work is moving toward not only who we are, but also what we are. That's part of our work. It's like character development, our ethics, our values, our character. Because we have to stop playing games and grow up guided by our spirituality, growing up to become ethical leaders. And what Butler talks about too is the distinction between rage and creativity. This movement toward an African spirituality can be fueled by rage and or creativity. Now I'm going to use both, but framing rage in a particular way. In the Americas, we have been taught that our emotions, including that of rage, is not valued. As Butler suggests, some adults who are inclined to have emotional ponds of still waters, and that they are often full of rage or resentment. They have bought into the lie that emotions are not valued, and so they keep it held up. Last week, I did a lecture on, again, systems theory and the idea of homeostasis and what happens when someone acts upon a system or not act upon the system. The system is going to do what the system wants to do, which is to protect itself. But then if someone changes or tries to change the system, there's movement, could be movement. There's going to be resistance. But the other part of it is, what if you don't do anything? That rage is there, and it's built up within oneself. And so to embrace rage and creativity, recognizing that our emotions are valuable. Because if we don't and we stay with that rage, it stifles us, it kills us. So to embrace rage and creativity. This African spirituality has a care ethic too. Care for the survival of the family and the community being very important to our work and to our being and to our living. Community is one that is at the heart of what is called interdependency, Ubuntu. And with this African spirituality, we remember and do the Sankofa move, as I call it, where I say it's not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. So we go back and fetch and get what we have forgotten. There's a book entitled Remembering the Things We've Forgotten. And we invoke Sankofa. We analyze those forces that controls the story of our being. We ask the question, is those forces life-giving and authentic, or does it serve a particular purpose to keep things status quo? And so we explore the forces that controls and perhaps continue to control our being. In invoking Sankofa, we claim knowledge of our ancestors and of ourselves. And Sankofa teaches that it is correct to reconnect with those traditions, with those cultures, with those people that knew a way out of no way. And then we travel forward. I'm sorry, I'm near a train, and so that's what you're hearing right now. We've traveled forward. We go back to move forward. And we move toward the mothered self of potential wholeness. The mothered self of potential wholeness. I did a lecture in trying to remember where I was, one of the Caribbean communities, countries, where I used some of the research and the work of that culture. And there was a book where in that book, there was a piece of prose called No Telephone, where the author writes this: her mother could not respond to her. Where had she gone? What were her ideas, her beliefs? Where were her mind and memories? It seems impossible that these things have vanished into thin air. The mothered self of potential wholeness. The place was Guyana. I'm remembering that now. And as I was preparing for this lecture, I also thought about George Floyd and how he called out for his mother. And I wrote this, also I was thinking about the young brother, Dante, who's 20 years old in Minnesota too, who was just recently killed. killed, where they show his mother talking about how she was told her son was dead. Their mothers could not respond to the tragedies of their deaths. One was already deceased. And so George knew to call to his mother. And Dante was on the phone with his mother when he passed away. Their mothers could not respond to the tragedy of their deaths. But in my African belief, they knew. Because if we're still and listen, mother will respond. And our foremothers are calling and telling us what still needs to be done. That of creating ma'at. Ma'at, just and human social system. And there's a need for us to engage in this. What one African psychologist, African-American psychologist, Yehudo Hotep suggests in his article, I use this with almost all of my classes, an article entitled Intellectual Maroons. And he suggests Ma'at restoration to assist with Ma'afa termination. No, Ma'afa is the great disaster, And imagine if we use Ma'atic principles for our restoration to assist with the termination of Ma'afa. One of the principles of African spirituality is that of responsibility. And so it is our responsibility to bring about ma'atic solutions, that of truth, justice, order, harmony and balance, reciprocity, goodness and righteousness, and with the end goal of human liberation. Engaging in ma'at, in which we find balance, is one of the important principles or aspects of ma'at. We begin to understand the world in which we live, and we position ourselves to survive. Yes, we are living in trying times. And when we notice this, acknowledge this reality, and I'm sure we all are, but then we can engage in the work we've been called to do, the justice work we have been called to do, by the virtue of us being God's people. Maladome Some, an African philosopher, in writing about his understanding of ma'at, suggests this: every person is sent to this outpost called Earth to work on a project that is intended to keep the cosmic order healthy. Every person is sent to this outpost called Earth to work on a project that is intended to keep the cosmic order healthy. What is your project? It is part of our African spirituality that we engage in the work of healing and wholeness for the collective, for the community. Because with embracing our African spirituality, we embrace that responsibility. But in order to do that, one has to be healed, or at least be working on one's healing. So therefore, one of the responsibility is for our own healing work, healing and health, and the responsibility to educate ourselves and the next generation. The need for teachers to do that. And all of us are theological educators. I should have said that earlier, but we're all theological educators. And the work that we are to engage in is redemptive socialization for our folk. So what is redemptive socialization? And I'm almost done with this presentation. Redemptive socialization is where individuals are taught how to identify and defeat the potential negative aspects and the effects of assaults, both overt as well as covert. We are called to care for the next generation by engaging in theological education that embraces redemptive socialization. And we reclaim our African soul. We engage in this work by asking ourselves, do we value ourselves? And what is our value? I'll give you an example. One that I'm still wrestling with is the movement in our new church. When we said that we're looking for new and younger people, maybe it hits me because I'm getting old. Or maybe it's because of my African understanding of the value of intergenerational work and engagement and relationship, where we honor both the elders as well as the youth. And so with this new direction of the church, does it take into consideration the African value of being intergenerational? If we don't value our African soul, we will not reclaim our African soul. This spiritual direction that we're going has to do with also assessing our capacity to love. One of my former students wrote a book entitled The Audacity to Love. So as we engage in some of these principles, these meiotic principles, we have to also assess our capacity to love. But I want to just for a moment go back to the idea of value. Randall Robinson, in one of his writings, and I can't remember exactly where I read some of his work, he talked about a question: not only do we value our African soul, but do we have value? I believe that we do. We just need to reclaim it. We have to go back and fetch some of those practices and ideas that have sustained us, and our community. We have to go back and reclaim even our wounded self. And we have to, as theological educators, of which all of us are, we must help others reclaim their selves too. Collectively, even with our woundedness, we are called to become wounded healers. Healing doesn't occur in a vacuum. We need to begin to mend our collective bodies. The mending takes place in connection with other bodies, in our communities and in groups. The communal healing can help us to steadily build respect, recognition, community, and even culture. In healing, true healing, as is the title of this lecture, healing is no trifling thing. It's hard work with a lot of responsibility. It would mean looking closely at ourselves and rethinking and relearning the lessons of how to be in relationship with God, with others, and with self. It would mean recognizing the lies that we've been taught about ourselves. It means recognizing the woundedness that has been done to our soul. It means engaging in the work of repairing of the woundedness for the sake of being all that God has called us to be, for the sake of God, for God's people, and all of humanity. But remember this too, that health is not simply the absence of illness. Real health is the will to overcome every form of adversity and use even the worst circumstances as a springboard for new growth and development. Because the essence of health is the constant renewal and rejuvenation of life. Yes, we have these jagged stones, as again, I'm looking for the quote that I have here from Randall Robinson, who is a political activist. He writes in the book, Defending the Spirit. From slavery, we have been subliminated our feelings. We have fought for our rights while hiding our feelings toward folks who tenaciously denied us their fights. We have even hidden those feelings from ourselves. And the anger corrodes around in our psyches like jagged stones, hiding deep anger, hiding deep anger. We don't acknowledge it, we don't direct it or aim it, but it is there. And so we are left with fragmented remnants of a tortured past, and we must reclaim our total wounded self to become, as Dr. Iva Carruthers suggested in her work, warrior healers. It is, however, difficult to instill a sense of pride and responsibility if people don't want to, if people don't know, don't have a memory of who they are, don't have the history. That's why the work of healing must include you as theological educators. Our understanding of who we are in relationship to God and who God is. If one downplays their woundedness, or perhaps are unaware of all that makes them who they are, including the shadow side of themselves, that's part of the soul. mention that in just a minute. I'm looking at the time. One can be trapped by conceptual incarceration, that is mental arrestment and imprisonment and constrictive belief systems, values, images, concepts, lifestyles, and worldviews. And they can become comfortable in captivity, maintaining the order of majority, minority, and have embraced the illusion of inclusion. All of this is from the work of Hotep entitled The Intellectual Maroon. Conceptual incarceration, comfortable in captivity, and embracing the illusion of inclusion. So we have to remember. We have to remember. We have to reclaim our souls through African spirituality. We have to reclaim our understanding of how we are defining ourselves. We have to remember to become a part of the rhythm of our passed on ancestors, such as Dr. Trout. We have to remember. Just briefly, I'm going to mention this book here, the Through. The author, Raphael Johnson, says that remembering, or raises the question, if dismemberment is pulling the body apart, remembering is putting the body back together. That's healing. So there is a need for us to heal in a collective community because of the mundane, extreme environmental stress that we are living with. We have to remember who we are and engage and remember what is dark and ancient and divine within ourselves that aids in our speaking, where we can make our way forward in creative ways to better inform our present activities. Raising the question again, do we want to be well? Because in the future, there are going to be Black folk. And so we need to engage, and it's Sankofa Mood, to engage in theological education with imagination and imagine ourselves as the people we want to be. Engage using our creative ashe, our creative energy that reproduces an evolution and perhaps a revolutionary train of events. This creative way would include postmodern way of thinking, the work of Monica Coleman, knowing that the future is womanist, engage in work of freedom schools, doing what I'm attempting to do in a small congregation in Minnesota, using grandmothers as theological educators, and using the work of Dr. Patrick Reyes in the form of theological exploration in doing so. And engaging in new and creative ways of doing work for the community in a program that I'm also creating, that of Fundy education, and for social entrepreneurship, so that we can breathe and remember and dream. I'm going to close now. There's so much more I could say, but I'm mindful of the time. I've gone on very long here, but I want to close with this song because I want you to dream and think of what healing might look like. This is a song called Dream Child. Yeah. Let's see if I can get it.
Dream child, let your spirit guide you to where you want to be. Rest, child, let your visions take you. You are in peace. Traveling may feel lonely sometimes, but all who wander are not lost. The journey is to look inside and find and find and find. Oh, traveling may feel lonely sometimes, but all who wander are not lost. The journey is to look inside and find.
Thank you. I hope you enjoy.
Camera's not cooperating. I took 2.5 pages of notes the first time I listened to your talk and added another page to it today.
Okay.
So a couple questions have already come in. I will ask folks, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm going to take moderator's privilege to start with a question of my own. As you know, in the ELCA in recent years, we have used the phrase African descent as a way of referring both to African Americans and to African immigrants in our church. And I noticed that you very intentionally throughout your presentation used either African ascent or African ascended. I have a sense of why you do that, but I'd like to ask you to explain the importance of that language.
Well, thank you for having me here, and thank you for the audience. I'm sorry, but that was too long. I don't lecture that long. I don't like lecturing. It was hard for me to even listen to it because it was so long, but thank you for your patience with me. I borrowed that from a Caribbean, Jamaican theologian who was the president of United Seminary in Jamaica, who in her presentation started talking about African ascent. We ascended from, we didn't come from, but we came up through, with the word I'm looking for, the diaspora. We're all over the place. And so I just claimed that idea that we did not come from, but we're a part of, and so we are descendants of. So that's how I use that term. You may have another understanding, or you may have heard it.
No, I had not heard the phrase before. And I think the notion of coming up through, I was thinking actually of how often, people's use of the phrase descendant or descend is related to ancestry searches. It does imply a kind of a devolution. And I think particularly for Black people, considering the ways in which white people have regarded Black people as less than human, to talk about your descent has very different connotations than the empowering language of talking about your ascent.
Right. Yeah. Dr. Marjorie Lewis, she's in Canada now. And part of the Daughters of African Atlanta, which I go to their conferences every 2 years, she talks about the power of Black women, African women all over the globe. And so again, using her terminology, I've embraced that as well. So.
Terrific. I'm going to take moderator's privilege to give you the second question sort of yourself, just to say, we know you recorded this a while ago. You've apologized for its people are commenting, no, we wanted it. It was good. No need to apologize. But I just wonder, having heard yourself now, is there anything that you want to add? Is there anything that strikes you differently or that you want to emphasize now that a little bit of time has passed since you first recorded this presentation?
I think the urgency of this work hit me more. There have been 2 incidents in recent days in my institution where I was reminded that the things that I'm taking for granted from my experiences of teaching at historically Black theological institutions, others may not know, and they're assuming that they're new and they're not. And so for me, the need and the desire and even the urgency of doing something different. No, it's not different. but raising the awareness of theological terms, theological understandings, spirituality. A recent, I'll give you an example. There was a presentation where someone was saying it wasn't theological. And so my question is, what do we mean when we say theological? You know, for me, almost every conversation, there's a theological bent to it. And so to say that an article or a paper, something is not theological, for me, that needs to be, for me, I need some clarity. And so there are things that I may be teaching or be saying that others don't understand either, you know, about African spirituality. I saw my dear friend, Reverend Priscilla, asking the question about Ma'at and Ma'at and Ma'afa, thinking they were acronyms when no, they're not, those are terms. And so there are things, because of my, I guess, my experience or exposure, I've gained some understanding and some wisdom around certain things that I think it's going to be important to share, again, for the healing of our folk. Things are getting worse in this country, unfortunately, or maybe they're more apparent. And so there's a need, I think, for us to do something different in our theological education.
Thank you. We're getting I'm looking at the questions coming in, and some of them are really basic ones, like, could you define this again? Or what was the term again? I will say, we haven't said this before, but this entire presentation and the Q&A will be available on Trinity's YouTube channel. So if your question is just something you didn't catch, I'm going to suggest that you can go back and scan later, or you know, mug the Dean of the Seminary. I want to make sure we use Dr. Wallace's presence with us to address some of the broader theological questions. And Deidre Avery, who's actually a student here at Trinity, whom you will all see if you come back for worship tomorrow. Deidre is our lector. She writes, you spoke of spiritual disengagement as putting us in the position of being the source of the mess. Can you talk more about this and perhaps even expand on your example with George Floyd?
Yeah, I've read that question and I'm trying to remember if I said that exactly. What I meant was that oftentimes when folks don't know who we are, with all of what's going on in society, and how we see Black folks, and a lot of the anti-Black rhetoric makes people think that what happened to George Floyd, what happened to Micaiah there in Columbus, Ohio, it's their fault. You know, they did something, not looking at systems and the whole history of why we are where we are, you know, why things happen. You know, why was it that police felt that they could act in particular ways? What's the history of policing in the African, you know, African-American history? 300 years ago, 400 years, that continues. But often we don't, and many people don't know the history, nor take any of that into consideration because, you know, Blackness is one where it's seen in a particular way. You know, it's bad. They're going to be drug addicts. You know, they're going to be violent. All of that without any consideration of the long history of subjugation and hurt and violence against Black bodies. So I think that's what I was trying to get at.
This is a very perhaps trivial example compared to the violence and deaths that you mentioned, but I was reading recently an article about the about Megxit, you know, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, and the comment was made that the royal family, at least certain members of the royal family, didn't reject Meghan because she was Black, but because she did not have sufficient respect for cultural difference. And I thought, you know, the nerve of incredibly elite white people telling a Black woman that she needs to respect their culture. That's not cultural difference, that's colonialism.
And the sad part about it, and I'm going to be transparent here too, is still happening even in our seminaries.
Yeah.
Where a student dropped my class because I didn't suggest, one of the requirements is to write using inclusive language. I'm the professor there, you know, and I mean, it went to I can't tell you how far and wide that conversation went, because the assumption that his way of thinking was the way it was supposed to be. And that me, even as a professor, could not tell him or even suggest that one of the requirements of my course is to use inclusive language. And so it's happening in our, you know, even in our seminaries.
Speaking of language, I'm going to jump to another linguistic question. Someone has written, I've heard that the term white supremacy is painful for some African Americans because it's followed by supremacy. Is white privilege a better term? What do you think?
I hadn't heard that argument. And so I don't know. I'm going to have to give it some thought.
Okay.
You know, perhaps over the next day or so, perhaps I can come back to that. But I had not heard
Okay.
supremacy versus privilege.
Yeah. So you were mentioning challenges at your own seminary. I think that that's a good transition to the question from Jessie Leclerc-Vacta, who actually is at your seminary.
I know, Jess.
And she asks, I think we'll probably get at this more in the panel discussion following the presentations of the doctoral students tonight, but she asked specifically how you think this has implications for the way in the ELCA we shape our candidacy processes, seminary admissions, curricula, in her language, leadership processes that make our emerging leaders of color responsible for their own mess.
Jessie, I'm going to get you. That's a mouthful. That's, I mean, so much work and so much deconstruction. You know, it's going to take some time. The fact that this conference and the theme of what I'm suggesting, even looking at the document about authentic diversity, and then unpacking the new direction of the church, unpacking all of that and the nuances and what does it mean? I mean, I think that's the work, and it's gonna take some time to do that. But there needs to be an awareness, and there's a need for additional theologians and conversation partners to do this work, where we're working and going in the same direction, that of the healing that's needed, not just for African Americans, but for the entire church. I used to teach at Hamline University, and I remember I had the poet Alexander can't remember her first name at the time, come into the class, and she talked about, it was a social justice class, and she talked about how in that class, students were being miseducated because it did not expose people to the wide variety of theological, of education. It was limited in a particular way. And so there's going to be a need for, again, unpacking what has been learned and what needs to be learned. I'm sorry, my uncle just walked in the house, and so it just discombobulated me. Okay, hold on one second. That's virtual conferencing. I'm sorry.
That's a two-part routine of Zoom. One is reminding people that they're still muted, and the other is seeing or hearing people, animals, here. Albert Starr asks, I think, a really important question, and one that's related to some of what you were saying. So how, in a predominantly Western European American culture and theological contexts like our seminaries, how do we move African theology from the perception that it's syncretistic because, you're picking up all these African things from outside? Well, I'm adding to this question. I think you get the point.
Yeah. I would say this is the mantra of emotional emancipation, defy the lies. It's not the truth. And so, it's pulling up those ways of knowing and learning and teaching that's fundamental, for the work that's being done globally, or it should be done globally. And so we don't have time to argue with institutions to say what you're doing is synchronous. No, it's a different, I don't want to say better, but maybe more grounded truth of the education that a lot of people don't know. And so who's making the assumptions that it's synchronous? Yeah, I think you got it.
Yeah, and what I've learned actually from decades of teaching church history is that, frankly, the entire Western European tradition is syncretistic. We deny that. We speak about, we white people, we people who are from the Western European tradition, speak about it as if there's somehow a uniform, unchanged path. But there was a whole lot of syncretism going on as the Romans expanded their way through the world. So we like our own syncretism, and we mislabel it as pure, and then we challenge other people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Reverend Priscilla Austin makes a wonderful comment about how one of the points you lifted up from Lee Butler's work, I think it was living in paradox, and that resonances with Lutheran theology, the way we often talk about it. Do you want to say a little bit more about how your adoption of Dr. Butler's framework resonates with Lutheranism?
Okay, and it also, not only Lee Butler's work, but the work of something that I've been working on for quite some time with Pauline Boss, work on ambiguous loss and ambiguous loss theory, and the fact that how then do we live in the tension? I remember when I was doing my approval essay, there was a question about what was it, church and society, and that, from a theological perspective. It's same kind of thinking. And what I'm proposing is that we've always lived with ambiguity in the paradox. And so what I'm doing even from Pauline Boss's work is reclaiming that. And I've recently published an article about how, and using, again, Queen Sugar's word, remove and understand the paradox and the understanding that not everything is clean and simple. That's not how things are. And what would happen if we embraced that for our own healing? How much freer would we be if, instead of getting, having angst about, well, it should be this way or that way, we live with the unknowing, and the ambiguity and the paradox of how things are.
It occurs to me that perhaps one distinction between the traditional way Lutherans use this language and the way you're using it is that it's easy for majority white Lutherans to talk about living in the tension or living in the paradox. You're challenging us to do it, not just to use the language.
Right. And to embrace the fact that we've always done it.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we are at time, but I love the very last comment in the Q&A is a comment from Jesse. Thank you, Dr. Wallace. The conversation continues. It continues in our institutions, yours and mine, but also it continues tonight and tomorrow. So we are going to be breaking now for 2 hours. We will reconvene at 7 when we hear from 3 Black doctoral students. I've had the privilege of listening to their talks already.
I know.
Some powerful resonances between what they say with each other and also what you have laid out for us. And I think the follow-up live conversation with Q&A will be a wonderful opportunity for us to keep exploring this. Just so y'all know, the screen that has the schedule of the events will keep scrolling. So if you don't remember what's what, that will help. Basically, after every session, we take off the session we just did and then keep the rotation going of what upcoming attractions. So this evening we have that panel with doctoral students. Tomorrow morning, we hope you will join us for worship at 10:30. Dr. Wallace is the preacher.
I don't preach. That's where Dr. Bridgman should be preaching.
Well, in any case, the here on this same Zoom link tomorrow, we will have worship at 10:30, and then we will have a conversation about womanist theology at 2:30. The other events, and you've seen this on the scrolling slide, the other events that happen tomorrow afternoon, other than the womanist theology conversation, need to be registered for separately. As you can see in this format, you can communicate with the panelists, but by writing in the chat box or the Q&A, but there's not the opportunity for live interaction. Tomorrow, there are 2 opportunities for discernment conversations led by Trinity's own Dr. Kevin Dudley. I'm trying to remember who else is on his panel. Pastor Brenda Smith, who was the director of the ELCA's Book of Faith Initiative, Bishop Yahel Curry, and also soon to be Dr. Seth Gators, who's a Trinity alum, who's working on his doctorate now at Ohio State. They will be sharing some of their own stories of spiritual discernment, and there's the link posted for you. And we asked for registration for this. This is a discernment conversation open to persons of African descent only. This is to center Black bodies, Black voices, Black experiences. So no white people get to show up to be a fly on the wall. I'm just going to be straight here. This is a conversation space we're providing for folks in the African ascent. community. No, I wish I could re-record. So anyway, those conversations take place at 1 and 8. And then also there's a Bible study at 3:30. So following the womanist panel, there's a separate link for that, which I'm sure one of our hosts will, yes, there it is. This will be led actually from 2 seminary students, 2 Black seminary students, one from Luther, one from Wartburg. The seminaries of the ELCA are trying to work cooperatively, especially, I mean, it takes at least 7 seminaries to change a church, right? I can't do it alone, you can't do it alone. But for both of these, the point of the separate registration is simply so that then you'll be logging in not to a Zoom webinar, but to a regular Zoom room where you can actually talk with the other people in the room. So we encourage you, if you haven't done that yet, you're certainly welcome to. For some of us now, this will be a dinner break until 7. For some of you, it may be a commute from where you've been watching this afternoon to where you'll be watching this evening. But Dr. Wallace, you have just launched us with so much, so many, I feel like you're the sower scattering the seeds, and we're going to see where they take root and grow, because you've really given us quite a lot, not just to think on, but to work with and to build from. So thank you so much. And we hope to see folks back here at 7 o'clock.